Welcome to Deutsche Welle, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, we'll talk about Ukraine and the Western Balkans in just a moment. But first, looking at the current events in China, I would like to ask for your assessment. What type of reaction do you expect from Beijing?
I feel it's very difficult to say just what is happening because we currently have so little information. But of course, I'm following it closely. And the images that we're seeing from Beijing and other cities around China move me. We all remember our own fight against the coronavirus, against the pandemic, and still remember how heavily it weighed on so many in Germany. We can only wonder what a burden it must be for the people of China, where measures are far stricter and further reaching, even today.
Die Maßnahmen ja viel strikter, viel langanhaltender sind bis heute reichen.
So I understand why people want to voice their impatience and their grievances on the streets. As a Democrat, I can only say that the freedom to express one's own opinion is important, and I can only hope that authorities in China respect the right to freedom of expression and the freedom to demonstrate. And of course, I hope the demonstrations remain peaceful.
What we are witnessing in Ukraine really has nothing to do with actual war in terms of military operations. It is a war against civilians. Why is Putin doing this, and what does it change for Germany?
I would dispute the idea that it has nothing to do with the war. I believe what we are seeing is part of the Russian war strategy. Not only do we have a brutal war of invasion being waged against the Ukrainian army, but also, and this is becoming clearer as winter approaches, a brutal attack on critical infrastructure, and with that, of course, on the civilian population. We fear, and this is something we have seen in recent weeks with the destruction of gas, heating and electricity infrastructure, what might await the people of Ukraine: hardship, darkness and cold. And these are not coincidental side effects, but rather it looks as if they are in fact the aim of Russian attacks, and that part of Russia's strategy is to hit the civilian population, to grind down the entire country. And that is what our solidarity has to stand up to. And that is why we have to help to guarantee these people survive the coming winter.
Germany is helping Ukraine even with arms deliveries. Ukraine has meanwhile begun praising Berlin for supplying weapons, yet Kiev is still waiting for battle tanks. Isn't this war against the civilian population reason enough for Berlin to reconsider its approach?
I feel that there has not only been a lot of thought in Germany, but also a complete rethink. We understood we had to make decisions, and that doesn't apply to the administration alone, but to the entire German population, who in just a few short weeks, in just a few months, recognized that the security we had come to know in Europe was no longer guaranteed. That led to the government passing massive defense spending measures, as well as better equipping the Bundeswehr. Above all, it actually led to us providing not only humanitarian, financial and economic assistance to Ukraine, but ultimately far more military assistance. I've been to Ukraine, as you know, and I can say the criticism that was being levelled against Germany over arms support has subsided, and there is instead a great deal of appreciation today. I also believe that the German federal government went with the right kind of support. When I was there, air raid sirens wailed daily, and people had to wait out attacks in bomb shelters. Investing in air defense, in protection against drones and especially missiles was exactly the right thing to do.
war genau der richtige Punkt.
And that is now helping cities and communities across Ukraine protect themselves as best they can. Of course, there is no total protection. But 60 to 70% of Russia's missiles are now being effectively countered by the Ukrainian army, also thanks to German military assistance.
Nevertheless, outside Germany, many people have the impression that Germany's first instinct is to say no, before eventually saying yes. Why is that?
Attempts are made to create that impression. Judging by conversations I have, and I get around in Europe and abroad, I don't get the impression that Germany's military contributions in solidarity with Ukraine are underappreciated.
Ukraine recently commemorated the 1 million victims of the Holodomor, the great famine that took place 90 years ago. This week, Germany intends to recognize this crime as genocide. Ukrainian President Zelensky has compared that historical crime to what is happening today. Is Putin carrying out genocide in Ukraine?
The
Holodomor is a crime that few in Germany know much about. But we must remember that it was the people of Ukraine who were the victims of that catastrophic famine. And the catastrophic famine was not the result of failed harvests, as had been claimed over the course of decades, foremost by Russian historians, but rather was a targeted strategy by the Stalin regime in 1932 and 1933 to starve parts of the population of the then Soviet Union in order to make them pliable. I am very, very grateful that the German Bundestag will take the opportunity to commemorate that great tragedy this week in a non-partisan parliamentary motion.
Mr. President, you know the warmongers in Moscow. Putin has spoken openly about his designs for Ukraine for years. The German leadership, including yourself, never took him seriously. How should one deal with the fact that he is now threatening to use nuclear weapons? Is that something different?
First, I would dispute the claim that it wasn't taken seriously. Just look at the years after 2014. I don't think any other administration in Europe was as engaged, not only in maintaining a ceasefire, but actually using that ceasefire as a gateway to peace. Then there is the Minsk agreement that we, together with France and the then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, negotiated with Russia. And you remember how I took part in untold numbers of attempts to achieve progress in that Normandy format with France, Ukraine and Russia. In the end, we were unsuccessful. But at the same time, in my view, it was right to make the effort. Second, in regard to the Russian threats to use nuclear weapons, I find them intolerable, especially as they come at a time when efforts are being made to create a future in which nuclear weapons are superfluous. The threat of nuclear weapons is therefore not only unjustified, it also runs counter to all of our historical experiences, and it is unacceptable. It is a further escalation of the war by Russia. There must be no use of nuclear weapons. And I believe that with this stance, we are in unison with nearly the entire world. Deliberations at the G20 in Bali were another expression of the clear rejection of such threats, let alone the actual use of nuclear weapons. A clear signal, hopefully one that Moscow will understand.
What paths do you see leading out of this war? What might a solution that is acceptable to both sides look like?
I believe anyone who claims to know what that path is overreaching. and we are in a phase of the war that is not headed towards a military resolution.
Auf eine Entscheidung hinausläuft, militärisch hinausläuft. Ich kann nur
All I can say is, thank God the people in Ukraine are brave, engaged, and standing up to the threat.
Stellen sich der Bedrohung entgegen. Und wir sehen eine Ukraine.
We're also watching as the Ukrainian army drives back a purportedly superior adversary, the Russian army.
Es ist nicht die Entscheidungssituation.
But this is not the decisive juncture from which we can see a way out. At least, I don't see one.
Alle Empfehlungen jetzt ein
It is also reckless to suggest a ceasefire now, because to establish a ceasefire at this point in time would essentially condone all of the injustice that has already taken place.
stattgefunden hat, eine Waffenstillstand jetzt.
A ceasefire now would mean that Russia would keep for its own the territories it has occupied,
Hält und damit
and its breach of borders, its flouting of international law, and its land grabbing would all receive an official blessing.
das kann nicht Sinn.
That cannot be the aim of a ceasefire. So sadly, I cannot say that I see any way out of the war at this time.
Den Ausweg noch nicht.
Above all, Ukraine wants security guarantees, including from Germany, before any negotiations start. Is that something Kiev can count on?
Die Ukraine hat
Ukraine has called for that.
Die Forderungen der Ukraine
Ukraine's demands, its expectations are known.
sind bekannt natürlich auch innerhalb
They are also, of course, known within the German federal government.
nicht nur aus Deutschland.
And there have been signals, not only from Germany, that security solidarity in the form of security guarantees may be feasible.
In Gestalt von Sicherheitsgarantien vorstellen kann.
But we are still at a stage where we cannot clearly say what those security guarantees would look like, who would provide them, and what they would have to entail.
Und welchen
Since the content of such guarantees are tied to the war actually ending, and since there is no end in sight right now, we cannot yet formulate security guarantees.
die Sicherheitsgarantien noch nicht ausformuliert sein.
Mr. President, we recently held our collective breath when 2 rockets hit Polish territory. How great is the fear that the war raging in Ukraine will eventually come to us?
Ich hoffe sehr, dass das Vermieden
I hope very much that that can be avoided.
ist stärker geworden.
And my hope has been bolstered, actually, by the very sensible reaction, not only from the United States, but from NATO as a whole.
Daten ausgezeigt worden ist, sondern von der NATO insgesamt. Es hat
There was close communication between the American president and the Polish president, right after the rocket impact in eastern Poland.
Kommunikation zwischen dem amerikanischen Präsidenten und dem polnischen Präsidenten.
There was also an immediate reaction from the head of NATO, from the Secretary General,
Spitze der NATO
announcing that the cause of the incident would be investigated before a reaction would be determined.
und dann die Reaktion zu ermessen. Ich glaube, das zeigt, dass
I believe that shows that level-headedness dominates among the NATO countries. And it also shows that a minimum level of military contact with Moscow remains.
militärischen Ebene mit Moskau
One thing that should be emphasized is that both sides should make use of such contacts, if they exist.
werden. Mir ist bekannt, dass
I know that according to newspaper reports, no one in Moscow picked up the phone when they were first called. That is an additional risk that must be avoided.
Risiko, was vermieden werden muss.
And what did you think of the back and forth that ensued after Germany offered to station Patriot missile systems in Poland?
Ich finde, Deutschland hat
I think Germany made an offer appropriate to the current threat level.
Bedrohungssituation angemessen ist, wie die polnische
How the Polish government deals with that offer is up to them. I know discussions are also taking place in Poland,
selbst
and I don't want to get involved in them.
sich einmischen will.
You are about to travel to North Macedonia and Albania. The war in Ukraine has given a new impetus to Europe, as well as to the Western Balkans. Will this war speed up the process of integrating the Western Balkans into the EU?
Ich weiß nicht, ob beschleunigt wird.
I don't know that it will be sped up, but my trip is definitely meant to signal the fact that we have not forgotten about the Western Balkans.
Wir haben natürlich auch Debatten.
Of course, we have also had debates with our Western Balkan colleagues who voiced concern that Ukraine's desire to join, to forge closer ties to the European Union, might be being handled differently, far more quickly than Western Balkan states are used to. I can understand some of the impatience. But, like many others, I will guarantee people there that no one has forgotten the Western Balkans. The trip to North Macedonia and Albania also serves to send a message to the entire region. When corresponding domestic progress is achieved, the path toward membership in the European Union also becomes more manageable.
The EU does not have a timetable for Western Balkan membership, though some there have set the goal of 2030 for themselves. When you speak with people there and in the parliaments, will you be able to say whether that is realistic?
Ich bin Präsident, kein Prophet.
I'm the president, not a prophet. And that is why I can only repeat that it all comes down to a willingness to pass domestic reforms and also a willingness to implement them. And we can also deal with states in the Western Balkans differently today because of the examples of North Macedonia and Albania, which have taken clear steps forward. That strengthens self-confidence in those countries and makes clear to others in the region of the Western Balkans that taking the step to join is worth the effort. Furthermore, we cannot forget that beyond the question of accession, in the narrower sense, progress is made along the path to membership. The Western Balkans accession process began in Berlin years ago. I remember that it was very tedious at first. But when I think about the last summit, I think that travel with personal identity cards, reciprocal recognition of school and university diplomas and degrees, the willingness of Europeans' support despite rising energy prices, those are significant steps forward. So I understand the impatience, no question, but we are not in a phase that calls for dejectedness, certainly not because of Ukraine, as we continue to keep our eye on the Western Balkan states and on North Macedonia and Albania, where there has been progress.
The EU expects fast reforms from the Western Balkans, but also says that it must reform itself before it can take in new members and begin negotiations. How long do you think that process will actually last?
It should go as quickly as possible, but I'll admit that at this moment I do not see signs suggesting the swift reform of European institutions. Since I have known European institutions from the inside for years, I know that we have had a series of multiple crises. We remember the Eurozone crisis. We remember more clearly the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016. We had a huge challenge for the European Union in fighting the coronavirus pandemic. Naturally, these crises all followed one another in rapid succession. And, as we can see now, some, like the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, continue to weigh upon us. That absorbs a lot of energy, while at the same time not leaving much mental capacity for inner reforms, which I will concede are desperately needed.
Most of the Western Balkan states have shown great solidarity during the war in Ukraine. They have implemented sanctions against Russia despite major concerns about the consequences. But Serbia has repeatedly put its close ties to Moscow on display. Is the EU doing enough to support the Western Balkans in their solidarity with Ukraine? And how should it deal with Serbia?
To answer the first part of your question, that is one of the reasons I am visiting the region. Because, of course, I also want to get a feel for the mood in those countries. And I think we will get a clear picture of the mood. Whether North Macedonia and Albania, in this situation in which they have not only showed solidarity with Ukraine, not only proven themselves by helping increase economic pressure on Russia, but rather where countries like North Macedonia and Albania also fulfill their obligations within NATO. And even beyond that for Albania, which currently sits on the UN Security Council. I'd say that's quite a lot that we can look at, that we should respect. But it should also spark self-confidence in those countries. I'm sure I will get a sense of whether that is the case during my trip. To answer the second part of your question regarding Serbia, we have to continue efforts to convince Serbia that the path it is currently following is raising questions and concerns about how serious the country is about finding its way into Europe. I've been accompanying the Western Balkans journey towards the European Union for nearly 20 years. And I've been to Serbia often. I'm certain that the people of Serbia don't want to step away from the desire, shared with many other Western Balkan states, to grow closer to the European Union and eventually become a member. Therefore, I can only hope and continue to attempt to convince Serbia's political leadership to pursue this path more clearly.
Finally, a word about this conflict between Serbia and Kosovo that has been settled at the last minute. What can Germany and Europe do to contain this security risk in the region in the long term?
As for the conflict, I find it a fitting final question, because its resolution shows once again how important Europe and the European Union are for the region. If there were no desire to look to Europe, then Europe would not have negotiating leverage in such conflicts between Serbia and Kosovo. Nevertheless, I am still convinced that it is the desire to come to Europe, to eventually join the European Union, a wish that is prominent in all of the Western Balkan states, that gives Europe leverage and the possibility to negotiate, and thus the ability to help find a solution in this seemingly tiny, at least in our eyes, seemingly manageable conflict over automobile license plates. If tiny conflicts can be dealt with, then perhaps larger conflicts could also be peacefully resolved, contributing to a normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo.
President Steinmeier, thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you.